Let's talk about what happens when a family business, something designed to care for people, becomes the front for a massive multi-million-dollar crime. This is a wild story about a financial scheme, a family that got tangled up with the law, and a legal fight that went all the way to Taiwan's Supreme Court.
So, get this. You've got one family. They're running 3 long-term care centers, and somehow they end up illegally taking in over 176 million new Taiwan dollars from unsuspecting investors. Now, this wasn't a business that just went under. The courts argued this thing was a criminal enterprise from the get-go. So how on earth did they do it? And, how did it all come crashing down?
All right, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to start with the family's business scheme itself. Then we'll look at the high-interest hook they used to lure people in. After that, we dive into the legal battle, focusing on the son's wild roller coaster ride through the courts and this really important question of what he knew. And finally, we'll wrap up with the final verdicts and the big takeaways from all of this. So, at first glance, the Wong family's business looked totally legit, right? A network of 3 care centers down in Pingtung. But behind the curtain, the way the family set up their roles, well, it was allegedly for a completely different reason. The court basically laid it out like a cast of characters in a movie. You've got the parents, Wang Chaoming and Cho Limin, pegged as the masterminds, the ones really running the show. Their kids? Well, they were the figureheads, the owners on paper. The son-in-law was the manager, the guy people would talk to. From the outside, it looks like a classic family operation, but prosecutors argued this whole structure was actually the key to their entire illegal plan. So the big question is, how does a pretty small network of care centers get a hold of millions and millions in cash? Well, they did it by making a promise that, frankly, it sounded way too good to be true.
Just let that number sink in for a second. Over 176 million NT dollars. That's more than 5 million US dollars. And this wasn't just a couple of friends loaning them money. The prosecution showed it was a systematic operation that pulled in cash for more than 30 different people. So what was the bait they were using?
And here it is, plain as day. This was the hook. While regular banks were offering, less than 3% interest a year, the Long family was out there promising these mind-blowing annual returns. We're talking 20, 30, even up to 60%. I mean, just imagine hearing that. In a world of low interest rates, an offer like that is almost impossible to resist. And for a lot of people, it wasn't.
And they weren't just whispering about this to friends. They took out ads in newspapers, which is a huge deal legally, because it means they were targeting the general public. This ad right here was a critical piece of evidence. Look at the language, seeking partners, create a win-win. And they even specifically called out retired teachers and doctors, people who they probably figured had a nest egg and were looking for a safe bet for their retirement. This public ask is exactly what turned it from a private loan into what the law calls illegal banking.
Yeah, so this wasn't just a situation where an investment went sour. No, prosecutors came in arguing that the whole fundraising idea was illegal from the very start, because it broke a really specific and very serious law.
And that law was the Banking Act. The logic here is actually pretty simple. If you go out to the public, take their money as deposits, and promise to pay them back with crazy high interest, you're basically acting like a bank. And if you don't have a banking license, that's a major crime. The court didn't see these as partnerships. They saw them as illegal deposits. The family had turned their care centers into their own private, unauthorized bank. Now, the legal drama really snaps into focus when you zoom in on one person, the son, Wang Chengyu. His parents were the alleged masterminds for sure, but his case became this fascinating lightning rod that shows just how tricky it can be for courts to figure out who's to blame in a complex family crime. I mean, just look at this timeline. It is absolute legal whiplash. First, the district court finds him guilty, sends him to prison for 4 years. Okay. He appeals. Then the high court completely flips it, acquits him of everything. He's not guilty. So the prosecution appeals that, and the Supreme Court says, nope, we're overturning that acquittal and sends the case back for a do-over. In the end, at the retrial, he's found guilty again, but this time with a much, much lighter sentence that's suspended. So what in the world was going on here? That judicial roller coaster, it wasn't about what the son did. Everyone agreed he signed the papers.
The whole thing, all those flip-flopping verdicts, it all boiled down to one single fascinating question. What did he actually know?
This was it. This was the whole ball game. Everyone knew he signed the contracts. He was the figurehead owner. But did he really get that what he was doing was part of a crime? The answer to that question would decide if he walked away a free man or went to prison.
And this brings us to this core legal concept called awareness of illegality. Simply saying, oops, I didn't know that was illegal almost never works in court. To get off the hook, you have to prove that your ignorance was, and this is the key word, unavoidable. You need a really, really good reason for not knowing you were breaking the law. And as you can guess, that is an incredibly high bar to clear.
And this just perfectly shows the legal tug of war. The High Court, when it acquitted him, basically said, look, this guy has a low IQ, a 63, and he was just doing what his parents told him to do. He couldn't possibly have known this was a crime. But then the Supreme Court came back and said, whoa, not so fast. They argued that a low IQ isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. He was an adult. He had a formal title. He signed his name on legal documents. And over 5 years, he had plenty of chances to ask questions. So they concluded his ignorance was not unavoidable.
And then the Supreme Court dropped another little bomb on this defense. They brought up this idea of unlawful doubt. This basically means you don't have to be 100% sure something is a crime. If you even just suspect it might be illegal, if you have that little voice in your head saying, this seems sketchy, and you do it anyway, that's good enough for the law to say you had awareness. It just shows how tough it is to argue you were completely in the dark.
So, after all that legal chaos, after all the back and forth, where did everything finally land? Let's take a look at how the court ended up assigning blame to the whole family. The final sentences really tell the story here. You can see the hierarchy of blame. The parents, the masterminds, they got the heaviest sentences by far, 9 years in prison each. The daughter and the son-in-law, who were seen as essential helpers, they got 5 years. And then you have the son. His whole legal saga ends with a suspended sentence, which means he stays out of prison. The difference is just, it's stark. And it all goes back to that big question of knowledge. So what's the big takeaway from all this? I think it's that blame, or culpability, is not a one-size-fits-all thing. You can really see how the law tries to draw a bright line between the architects of a crime and the people who helped them, the accomplices. The parents, who designed the whole scheme, they faced the biggest consequences. And everyone else got a sentence that reflected their specific role and, in the son's case, what the court ultimately decided he was capable of understanding. This whole case really leaves us with a tough, lingering question. When your loyalty to your family bumps up against the law, where do you draw that line? The court gave its legal answer, sure, but that moral and ethical dilemma, that's something we're all left to think about.